What if the loudest message in this entire controversy isn't what's being said, but who isn't saying anything at all? Because when a political figure with millions of followers is gone, a widow takes center stage and the parents vanish from the picture. That's not just awkward, that's a storyline begging for questions. And today we're breaking down why critics believe Charlie Kirk's parents are furious, why TPUSA is under fire for alleged profiteering, and why the silence might be louder than any press conference. Buckle up. It starts with something so quiet that most people missed it at first. Not a scandal, not a headline, not even a quote, just absence. In a moment when cameras usually race toward grieving parents, when microphones practically chase mothers and fathers demanding answers, Charlie Kirk's parents weren't there. No press conferences, no sit-down interviews, no emotional statements read through trembling hands. Instead, the spotlight snapped directly to Erika Kirk, and it stayed there. Viewers didn't notice it right away because grief is chaotic, and silence can feel respectful, but the longer the quiet dragged on, the louder it became. People began whispering the same question: why does this tragedy have a lead character and no supporting parents? In a media ecosystem that thrives on raw emotion, the absence felt less like privacy and more like a decision, and decisions always have a reason. And here's where the unease really settles in. Charlie Kirk wasn't an unknown figure whose family wanted to grieve in peace. He was a national political force, followed by millions, honored at the highest levels, and publicly mourned by powerful institutions. His parents weren't strangers to pressure or publicity. They were accomplished, educated, and fully capable of speaking if they wanted to, which is exactly why their silence became suspicious to commentators. This wasn't the quiet of people overwhelmed by cameras. It was the quiet of people stepping back from a narrative they didn't seem eager to endorse. Meanwhile, Erika filled the vacuum effortlessly. Interviews, speeches, leadership roles, all while the people who raised Charlie remained off stage. And that contrast, it's the kind of storytelling whiplash that makes audiences lean forward, lower their voice, and say, okay, something's not adding up. Because in public tragedies, silence isn't empty, it's loaded, and everyone knows it. And once you notice who's missing, you can't unsee who's suddenly everywhere. The thing about grief is that it usually looks messy. Late nights, canceled plans, unanswered texts. That's why so many viewers blinked twice when, instead of silence, they saw a perfectly functioning machine revved to full speed. Within weeks, Erika Kirk wasn't just present, she was leading, speaking, hosting, fundraising, and carrying the public face of a massive organization like someone who'd been rehearsing for the role. To supporters, this was inspiring, a masterclass in composure under pressure. To critics, it felt like watching someone skip the mourning phase and go straight to the victory lap. Jokes started circulating online that the organization didn't even pause long enough to change slides before the next donor pitch. Dark humor, sure, but humor is often how people process discomfort when something feels off but can't quite be named. And then came the unease, the kind that creeps in quietly, because leadership transitions after tragedy usually come with guardrails, interim titles, shared authority, slow handoffs. This one came with a spotlight and a schedule. Commentators began asking whether grief had been transformed into momentum, and whether momentum had quietly become control. Not accusations, questions, the kind that make people shift in their seats. Because when someone assumes power during a moment when criticism feels morally forbidden, the silence around them can become louder than any speech. And that's the suspense hanging in the air. Was this strength, or was it strategy? And if it was strategy, who decided that now, of all moments, was the right time to press fast forward? But the timing only raised eyebrows more when money entered the conversation. As the weeks passed, online discussions began circling around eye-popping fundraising numbers tied to Turning Point USA in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death. Depending on who was speaking, commentators, critics, or independent creators, figures floated anywhere from tens of millions to well over $100 million. None of these numbers were presented with a neat bow of audited confirmation in the public square, but they didn't need to be. The conversation wasn't about spreadsheets, it was about scale. The sheer magnitude being discussed shifted the emotional temperature of the story. When grief intersects with numbers that sound like lottery jackpots, people stop whispering and start squinting. What intensified the backlash wasn't just the alleged sums, it was who was allowed to monetize and who wasn't. Critics pointed out a growing contradiction. Independent commentators were publicly condemned for profiting off tragedy, while large-scale institutional fundraising tied directly to Charlie's name and legacy was framed as noble, necessary, and untouchable. That double standard became rocket fuel for suspicion. To supporters, this was apples and oranges. An organization funding a mission versus creators chasing clicks. To skeptics, it looked like the same act wearing a better suit. The more the word family was used to describe the organization, the more critics asked why the financial operations felt increasingly corporate, strategic, and aggressively protected from scrutiny. And that's when people started asking, if this is family, why does it feel like business? One of the most unsettling details people couldn't shake wasn't something that was said, it was what wasn't. As Erika Kirk became increasingly visible in media appearances, leadership roles, and public events, Charlie Kirk's parents remained almost entirely absent from the public conversation. No press conferences, no interviews, no coordinated statements of support. In high-profile tragedies, parents are usually front and center, demanding answers, honoring their child, or at least standing visibly beside the surviving spouse. Here, that script didn't play out, and when the expected pattern breaks, people notice. Critics didn't interpret the silence as weakness or grief alone. They interpreted it as distance, body language at public ceremonies, positioning during events, and the lack of visible alignment fueled speculation that something deeper was at work. Supporters argued the parents simply wanted privacy, choosing to grieve away from cameras. Skeptics countered with a blunt question: privacy from what exactly? The media or the narrative? When a widow is omnipresent but parents are nowhere to be seen, it creates a visual imbalance that invites interpretation. Silence, intentional or not, becomes its own form of communication, especially when everyone else is speaking loudly. And when the people who raised him say nothing, people start asking what they're refusing to endorse. One moment that froze people mid-scroll was how quickly forgiveness entered the public narrative. Very early on, Erika Kirk publicly emphasized forgiveness, faith, and moving forward. Language rooted deeply in Christian tradition and, to many supporters, a sign of spiritual strength. In isolation, forgiveness isn't controversial, but timing matters. And here, the timing raised eyebrows. This wasn't months later, after investigations unfolded or emotions settled. It was almost immediate, delivered while questions were still unanswered and the shock was still raw. Critics didn't attack the concept of forgiveness. They questioned the function of it. In high-profile tragedies, forgiveness can soothe, but it can also silence. Once forgiveness is framed as the moral high ground, anyone still asking questions risks being labeled cruel, disrespectful, or unfaithful. Some viewers felt the message subtly shifted the tone from "what happened" to "why are you still asking?" Supporters saw grace. Skeptics saw a narrative pressure valve, something that lowered the temperature before the room had even figured out what caught fire. Because once forgiveness becomes the headline, curiosity starts looking like a sin. This is where the story stopped speaking and somehow started shouting. While the public was being told to move on, trust the system, and lower the volume, the absence of detail became the detail. It's like hosting a press conference titled "Everything is Fine" and then refusing to take questions. People aren't rude for noticing, they're human. Silence doesn't calm curiosity, it gives it caffeine. And here's the suspenseful part: silence always creates two camps. One says they're being respectful, the other whispers they're being careful. And the internet? The internet grabs popcorn and a corkboard. Every missing explanation becomes a blinking red arrow. Every unanswered question becomes a theory starter pack. Not because people want chaos, but because when a story this big stops talking mid-sentence, the audience assumes the sentence isn't finished. It's just being edited. And once that divide was visible, critics started digging backward. As different interviews, statements, and explanations accumulated over time, observers began noticing small inconsistencies. Not dramatic gotcha moments, but subtle mismatches. Timelines that felt compressed. Details that changed emphasis depending on the audience. Statements that were technically correct on their own, but didn't quite line up when placed side by side. To supporters, these were normal variations under pressure, grief, stress, and evolving information. To critics, they felt like narrative adjustments, not clarifications. In the age of clips, screenshots, and receipts culture, even minor shifts are magnified. When one person says A, another says mostly A, and a third says A but later, the internet doesn't hear nuance. It hears static, and once static enters the signal, trust starts buffering. Because coincidence is one thing, but repetition starts to look like a pattern. As scrutiny intensified, many observers noticed a shift in tone, not toward transparency, but toward containment. Messaging became tighter, responses felt more corporate. Questions were framed as harmful, divisive, or disrespectful, rather than simply unanswered. The priority appeared to move from explaining events to stabilizing the organization's image. This is a classic crisis management dilemma. When a brand is under pressure, leadership often focuses on message discipline, not open debate. The problem is that message discipline can look a lot like avoidance when the audience is asking emotional emotional, unresolved questions. Instead of calming speculation, this approach can actually fuel it, because people tend to trust conversation more than coordination. Because the moment trust becomes a PR problem, the internet stops listening and starts investigating. As public pressure grew, many observers noticed a familiar pattern. Instead of engaging questions head-on, the response shifted toward discouraging discussion altogether. Questioning became framed as harmful, divisive, or disrespectful to grief. From a human standpoint, that instinct makes sense. Nobody wants chaos during mourning, but from a media standpoint, it often has the opposite effect. This is the classic Streisand effect in action. When people feel told not to ask, curiosity doesn't disappear. It sharpens. Audiences begin to wonder why certain topics are sensitive, why timelines can't be revisited, and why silence is being treated as a moral requirement. The attempt to end discussion can unintentionally signal that the story is unfinished, even if leadership believes it is. Because once people feel pushed away from the truth, they don't leave, they dig. By this stage, something subtle but powerful had happened. The conversation wasn't being driven by new leaks, clips, or revelations anymore. It was being driven by absence. No clarifications, no timeline walkthroughs, no unified explanation that addressed contradictions directly. Just a widening gap between what people expected and what they received. And in media culture, silence isn't neutral, it's interpretive. To many observers, the quiet didn't read as closure, it read as containment. When public figures, institutions, or families stop engaging while controversy remains unresolved, audiences naturally start assigning meaning to that pause. Is it grief, strategy, legal advice, fatigue, maybe all of the above? But once speculation fills the space, control over the narrative slips away. At that point, the story doesn't belong to any one person or organization. It belongs to the crowd trying to make sense of it, because when nobody explains the ending, the audience writes one themselves. So here's the question no press release can answer. When the timeline keeps shifting and the silence feels intentional, who gets to decide when the truth-seeking stops? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you believe asking questions isn't disrespectful, pretending nothing's wrong is, and subscribe if you want breakdowns that follow patterns instead of talking points. Because when everyone tells you to move on, that's usually when the real story is just getting started.